The Moonlight Sonata is not in because what is there is stranger than direct quotation and more interesting than the simplified inversion story that every Beatles biography has been repeating for 50 years. Lennon heard Yoko Ono playing Beethoven's Opus 27, number 2, the Sonata in C-sharp minor, first movement, and asked her to play the chords backwards. Not in strict retrograde, not in rhythmic mirror, but with the harmonic direction of the movement inverted. What descended would ascend, what resolved would tension. The anecdote appears in virtually every journalistic profile of Abbey Road as a charming footnote and is immediately set aside. That is an analytical error. What Lennon built from that instruction was not a transcription of Yoko's exercise. It was a harmonic progression with genealogical kinship to Beethoven that is not Beethoven, one that shares the sustained tension quality of the sonata's first movement, while systematically refusing the resolution logic that organizes the original. Because was born from the Moonlight Sonata, the way a child carries parental DNA without being either parent. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata in C-sharp minor operates over a triplet ostinato in the bass sustaining harmonies of mounting tension toward tonic resolution. The classical mechanism of sonata form, as Beethoven inherited it from Haydn and Mozart, and developed it toward an emotional expressiveness that ruptured the formal expectations of Viennese classicism without abandoning functional harmonic grammar. What Lennon extracted from that model was not the specific progression, nor the bass ostinato. It was the quality of suspension, the feeling that the harmony is always one step from somewhere that never fully arrives. Because does not resolve the way listening conditioned by Western functional tonality anticipates. It approaches, it deflects, and the distance between the approach and the deflection is where the song lives. The central tonality of because is a major, or more precisely, an A major permanently disturbed by modal borrowings and chromaticism that render the tonic less an anchor than a fiction of stability the progression sustains out of structural necessity rather than harmonic conviction. The opening builds over an A major chord that immediately yields to a diminished chord, a semitone tension that in functional tonalism demands urgent resolution, and here simply remains, breathing, before moving to C-sharp minor, then to D major, then through chromatic passages that reference the tonal field without committing to it. The movement is linear at the surface. The vocal melody rises and falls in recognizable contours, and harmonically oblique underneath. Each chord arrives at the next step through a logic that listening recognizes as coherent without being able to anticipate. This is not accidental sophistication. It is the result of Lennon operating in August 1969 with a harmonic understanding developed across a decade of intensive exposure. To music theory through George Martin, to the modal harmonies of British and Celtic folk, to the tonal jazz that the Liverpool scene of the late 1950s had absorbed, and to the psychedelic experiences that, independent of any moral judgment, documentably altered temporal perception and tolerance for harmonic ambiguity in composers of that period. Lennon in '69 was not the rhythm and blues guitarist who had written Love Me Do in 1962. He was a composer who had arrived, through accumulated experience and systematic destruction of aesthetic habits, at a position where sustained dissonance was no longer a problem to be resolved, but a state in which music could exist with integrity. Because was recorded in the first weeks of August 1969 at Abbey Road Studios, under conditions that document the internal state of the band during its terminal phase, with uncomfortable clarity. The Abbey Road sessions were a constant negotiation between four musicians who had already decided, in varying degrees of conscious articulation, that the collective project was finished. McCartney produced with the pragmatic efficiency of someone archiving a body of work before it disappears. Harrison had finally secured genuine album space with Something, and Here Comes the Sun. Starr arrived, played with the precision that had always defined him, and remained conspicuously outside the ego conflicts. Lennon oscillated between disengagement and flashes of concentrated brilliance, and Because was one of those flashes, composed and delivered to the band with the urgency of someone who knows the clock is running out. The instrumentation of the track is the first element that standard criticism consistently undervalues. There is no drum kit. There is no electric guitar. There is no conventional bass. The texture is built exclusively on the Moog Synthesizer, played by George Harrison, a harpsichord played by George Martin, and the vocal harmonies of Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison. That instrumental austerity is not minimalism as aesthetic principle. It is the precise choice to eliminate the sonic markers that identified the Beatles as a rock band, leaving only the harmonic structure and polyphonic texture visible. Because sounds unlike anything else in the Beatles' catalogue, not because it is experimentally avant-garde, but because it surgically removes everything that made the Beatles sound immediately recognizable as the product of that specific group. And what remains is pure architecture. George Harrison and the Moog. This is the point where the dominant Abbey Road narrative resolves with imprecision, assigning the instrument an atmospheric coloring role when its function is structural. Harrison had approached the Moog Synthesizer with unusual seriousness for a rock musician of the period. His preparation included learning sessions with Bernie Krause, who alongside Paul Beaver had been among the first musicians to explore the Moog's possibilities outside the context of academic electroacoustic music. Beaver and Krause had released Ragnarok, electronic funk, in 1969, and Harrison knew their work. When the Moog arrived at the studio for the Abbey Road sessions, Harrison was not an amateur fascinated by a new toy. He was a musician who had practiced the instrument sufficiently to deploy it compositionally, controlling attack, decay, sustain, and release with the specificity that a conventional instrumentalist would apply to performance dynamics. On Because, Harrison's Moog defines the harmonic texture in a way that Martin's harpsichord complements, but does not determine. The synthesizer sustains chord voicings with a timbre that occupies an unusual spectral range for rock in '69. Neither the percussive attack of a piano, nor the organic sustain of a Hammond organ, nor the natural harmonic richness of a string instrument, but a calculated combination of envelope and oscillation that sounds simultaneously electronic and organic. That timbral hybrid quality is functionally important. It allows the harmonic progression to be perceived with the analytical clarity of a keyboard instrument, while retaining a breathing quality that the conventional electronic instrument of the period did not possess. Harrison's Moog on Because is not decorative. It is the voice that holds the harmony in place while the human voices inhabit it. And the human voices are the technical heart of the track, and the element most systematically misdescribed in any journalistic analysis that stops at mentioning beautiful vocal harmonies. Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison recorded 3 distinct vocal parts, functionally approximate to soprano, mezzo, and baritone, and each part was recorded 3 times in overdub. The result is 9 vocal tracks, 3 melodic lines, each tripled. The mix fuses the 3 instances of each line to create a single choral timbre, no longer recognizable as individual Lennon, individual McCartney, or individual Harrison, but as a collective voice of specific texture, denser than a conventional vocal trio, with a spatial resonance that concert halls produce through acoustic reflection, and that here is produced through track layering in analog space. The comparison this texture demands is not with rock, it is with the Renaissance madrigal. The 16th century madrigal, particularly in the forms developed by Gesualdo, Monteverdi, and Marenzio, explored 3, 4, and 5 voice vocal polyphony as a mechanism for effective text treatment. Harmony responded to words with specific chromaticism, with dissonances placed at precise semantic moments, with resolutions that arrived exactly when the text demanded relief and were suspended when the text demanded tension. Because operates on this logic without having been consciously composed with it in mind, which is, in a certain sense, more impressive than if it had been, because it demonstrates that Lennon had internalized a compositional principle without passing through the process of its theorization. The words, "Because the world is round, it turns me on," receive a progression that rises and opens. "Because the sky is blue, it makes me cry," receives a descending inflection with chromaticism that in an analysis of Renaissance vocal music would be classified as direct word painting. The music descending as the text speaks of sadness, the chromatic notes functioning as the auditory equivalent of a sob. This is not coincidence. It is the result of a composer working at the limit of his intuition, which, in August 1969, after 10 years of accelerated development, had reached a synthesis between unconscious technical procedure and cultivated musical instinct that is the operational definition of mastery. The structural position of "Because" within Abbey Road's arc is the third point that conventional analysis treats as accidental, when it is, in fact, an architectural decision with measurable tonal consequences. The album divides on the classic vinyl model into 2 sides. Side 1 contains relatively autonomous individual songs: "Come Together Something," Maxwell's Silver Hammer, "Oh Darling," Octopus's Garden, "I Want You," She's So Heavy. Side 2 opens with "Because," and then descends into the great suite of medleys that occupies its remaining 15 minutes, from "You Never Give Me Your Money" through the end, with the Her Majesty coda. "Because" is not part of the suite. It is the threshold that precedes it, the decompression chamber between the song format of side 1 and the through-composed format of side 2. Its function in the album is simultaneously tonal and formal. Harmonically, it establishes the field of unresolved tension that the suite will elaborate. Formally, it prepares the listener for the absence of individual song closure that the suite will systematically refuse to provide. Side 2's suite concludes with the end. 82 bars of construction and resolution that include Ringo Starr's only recorded drum solo on any Beatles release, and an exchange of guitar solos between Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison that several musicologists have argued represents the only moment of genuine democratic balance in the band's late history. But that resolution is only comprehensible as resolution if Because's field of tension was successfully installed at the beginning of the side. Without Because as pressure chamber, the end is merely an animated finale. With Because, the end is the resolution of a tension built across 18 minutes, and McCartney's closing lines, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make," carry the philosophical weight they deserve, precisely because they arrive after 18 minutes of harmony that had promised, suspended, disturbed, and deferred any definitive resolution. Abbey Road was the last album the Beatles recorded. Let It Be was released afterward, in May 1970, but had been tracked in January of '69, months before the Abbey Road sessions. What Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Starr did at Abbey Road Studios between July and August of '69 was record the final chapter of a collective project that all four knew was ending, with varying degrees of grief and relief. Because composed and delivered by Lennon in that context carries the specific quality of a piece written by someone simultaneously closing and opening, ending the Beatles project with the maximum technical precision of which he was capable, and opening the solo phase with a voice that had learned it didn't need electric guitar and drums to exist with authority. The Lennon who composed Because is the same one who would produce Working Class Hero in 1970, Imagine in 1971, and the most austere works on the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band album, tracks built with instrumental economy and concentrated harmonic density rather than instrumental density. The continuity between Because and Lennon's solo phase is direct and technical, not merely thematic. He had discovered, through the song's proof that it functioned without the Beatles' conventional sonic markers, that those markers were dispensable, and that harmonic structure was what had always sustained the project. The inevitable internal comparison within Abbey Road is with Harrison's Something, the album's other harmonically sophisticated major piece. Something is harmonically rich in the sense of a sophisticated love song. The opening progression in C major with the descending chromatic bass movement, C, CMAJ7, C7, F, is immediately recognizable as the gesture of a composer who had studied the harmonic language of the more elaborate soul and R&B of the 1960s, Ray Charles, Smokey Robinson, and absorbed it into his vocabulary. It is a progression that resolves with satisfaction, that fulfills its promises, that treats the listener with the generosity of someone offering a complete experience. Because does not offer that. Because suspends, deflects, returns to the tonic without the tonic feeling like home. The difference between the two songs on the same album is the difference between two composers at different points in their relationship with harmonic resolution. And that difference is, in itself, a document of the Beatles' creative state in their final 2 months of functional existence as a group. There is an element of Because's recording that audio engineering rarely documents with precision, the spatial treatment of the 9 vocal tracks in the final mix. Engineer Jeff Emmerich, who had returned to the Abbey Road sessions after leaving during the tense White Album recordings, applied to the voices a reverberation that places them in an acoustic space corresponding to no existing physical environment. It is not the reverberation of a concert hall, not the dry ambience of a recording studio, not the echo of a stone chamber. It is a space constructed specifically for those voices in that progression, an acoustic architecture created so that the 9 lines would sound as though they originated inside the listener's head rather than from a stage or a loudspeaker. That mixing decision is consistent with the psychedelic aesthetic that had dominated Beatles recordings since Revolver in 1966. The idea that the recording studio is not a documenter of performances, but an autonomous compositional instrument, capable of creating spaces and textures impossible outside its cables and consoles. Emmerich had developed this principle with the Beatles progressively, the reversed tape effects on Tomorrow Never Knows, the ADT textures on Strawberry Fields Forever, the radical source isolation on Sgt. Pepper. On Because the application is subtler and therefore more effective. The reverb does not call attention to itself, is not audible as artifice. It is a mixing decision that renders the vocal texture immersive without the listener identifying the mechanism. It is the auditory equivalent of a well-executed conjuring trick. You experience the result without perceiving the technique that produced it. There is a genealogical line that the progressive rock historiography rarely traces, because tracing it would require acknowledging that the Beatles' most significant contribution to the genre came not from McCartney in his formal composition ambitions, not from Harrison in his sitar and Indian classical experiments, and not even from Sgt. Pepper as a concept album. It came from Lennon on Because, a 3-minute and 46-second song that demonstrated that a harmonic progression derived from Beethoven, played on an analog synthesizer by a musician who had studied with Californian electronic music engineers, sung in 9 vocal tracks structured as Renaissance polyphony, without drums, without electric guitar, without bass, was capable of generating a musical experience of greater emotional intensity and intellectual density than anything most rock bands could produce with full instrumental arsenals. The British progressive rock that emerged between 1970 and 1974 heard Abbey Road. Yes, Genesis, King Crimson, Gentle Giant. All of them heard it. And what they absorbed from Because, even if none of them ever cited it directly, was proof that instrumental austerity combined with harmonic density was a sustainable compositional position, that removing instruments from the texture rather than adding them was frequently the most radical available decision, and that the human voice, treated with the seriousness that European composition schools reserved for the madrigal and the motet, was capable of carrying complex formal structures without orchestral arrangement or guitar virtuosity as support. Gentle Giant, specifically, would pursue this principle to its most rigorous conclusion on albums including Octopus and In a Glass House. Vocal polyphony as compositional argument rather than ornament. But what nobody extracts from Because is the most unsettling implication the song places on the table. That John Lennon, in August 1969, was composing at the highest level of his career, and that the band he had helped build was dissolving around that brilliance without any combination of talent or grief being able to stop it. Because is the last time Lennon delivered a composition to the Beatles and received back a collective performance equal to what he had brought. The end is the final chapter. Because is the last deep breath before he begins. The Moonlight Sonata continues to be performed in recital halls across the world, with Opus 27, Number 2, cycling in and out of beginner programs and conservatory recitals with the predictable regularity of works that have passed into the domain of the familiar. Beethoven did not know in 1801 that 168 years later, a Japanese woman would play those chords for a former Beatle in a London flat, and that the former Beatle would ask her to play them backwards. He did not know that the resulting transformation would produce one of the harmonically most sophisticated works of the second half of the 20th century. He did not know that that specific sonata, in that specific flat, would generate a progression that still sounds, 50-odd years later, like something rock music doesn't quite know what to do with. It never did.